You are listening to From the Sea, a podcast series produced by South China Sea Studies. This program provides valuable insights from experts around the world on geopolitical and security developments, with regards to the South China Sea as an area in a connected maritime landscape. In today's episode, Association, Professor Charmaine Willoughby from de Salle University will discuss with our host, talking about the Philippines Transparency Campaign in the South China Sea.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of From the Sea podcast, and today is my pleasure to be sharing a conversation with Professor Charmaine Willoughby from de Salle University.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. So the topic that I wanted to focus on today regarding the information campaign that the Philippines has been pursued in the South China Sea. So in this past year from 2023 up until now, there have been a lot of incidents that happened near or around the second Thomas Shoal in the Spratly, and we've seen that the Philippines have been coming out very quickly with public statement, the Coast Guard and the foreign services coming from different levels, and there are also a lot of media coverage and even media personnel being brought on some of the vehicle to record footages. Some people have said that the Philippines is pursuing some sort of a transparentization strategies. Do you think such strategy exists, or do you think it's just a temporary tactic to deal with recent development in the South China Sea?
Wow, that's a really good question. Our National Security Council did say that we are implementing a transparency. I don't know if we call it a strategy, a tactic, an approach, but certainly it's along the lines of calling China out whenever it's doing certain actions and moves in the West Philippine Sea. I think it's important to remember that this is simply one amongst the many mechanisms that the Philippines has done over the years. During the Duterte administration, there were a lot of information campaigns that were, I would say, rather biased towards China, in the sense that those campaigns were sweeping under the rug what China was doing. But since the Marcos administration in 2022, when President Marcos became president, he initiated a more robust policy towards China, in the sense that we started calling out China's actions. So there's a lot of pushback now when there's harassment going on by the Chinese Coast Guard towards the Philippine Coast Guard and their use of the maritime militia, for instance. So there's now some level of resistance and pushback against China. And in many ways, this seems to be working in the Philippines' favor. So our propaganda war, if we can call it that, against China seems to be working.
Okay, well, that touches upon a lot of issues that I also want to address next. You mentioned that this is just one among many things that the Philippines has been pursued for a while. So this is not something new, right? But then you mentioned that under Duterte, there were some sort of differences in comparisons with the current Marcos administrations when it comes to the approach to information campaign. Could you maybe clarify a little bit more on the differences?
Certainly, I mean, there are stark differences between the Duterte and Marcos administrations in how they dealt with not just the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea issue, but also how they handle the narratives surrounding the maritime domain. During the Duterte administration, he came to power. He became president in June 2016. And based on that timeline, July 2016 was when the award from the Permanent Court of Arbitration was released. During the campaign, President Duterte had a very strong stance against China. If you look back, you would recall that President Duterte, during the campaign trail, even said that he would ride a jet ski out in the South China Sea and plant the Philippine flag to establish, our sovereignty in our territory. But once he became president, his foreign policy became characterized as a quote-unquote a pivot to China. So that really became kind of like a launching pad for him to minimize the importance of the arbitration award and turning closer to China. To be fair, it did improve the bilateral relationship between China and the Philippines, but at the cost of leveraging the arbitration award, which was heavily in favor of the Philippines, to kind of offset the arbitration award on one hand and Duterte's desire to be closer to China. The kinds of narratives that were propagated and that circulated in social media really pointed out to the idea that if the Philippines were to fight for the West Philippine Sea, we will not stand a chance. We will be defeated within 10 minutes of fighting. So that kind of positioning really engendered a very defeatist strategy or defeatist attitude on the Philippines. It's as if saying, we're gonna lose anyway, so let's not even engage in a fight. So that's one narrative, one information campaign that circulated during the Duterte administration. It resonated very well because we have not yet completed the modernization of our armed forces. So, if we were to compare ourselves with the PLA, obviously there are asymmetries that are very, very stark. So if we compare that with the kinds of information campaigns now surrounding the Marcos administration, the campaigns today really highlight that even though we are not at the same level of military sophistication towards China, there are ways that we can use to stand up against China's moves. So that's why President Marcos has always been approaching our partners, reintroducing the Philippines as a credible international partner. And that's also and that's also the context of the Transparency Initiative, where we call China out whenever it's doing certain actions.
So you say that the whole transparency initiative that you're pursuing, it is decided at the very top level, presidential level, would you say?
I'm not sure if that's exactly how we should frame it, because I think it's a fluid approach. It's happening on the ground, then it's something that the president heard about, and then he's also saying like, okay, this is a good thing that the Philippines is doing. So it's really very fluid instead of just very top down.
Do you have any example of the Philippines sweeping under a rug certain things or certain narrative or certain developments back in the Duterte administrations that you could share?
So during the Duterte administration, there were a lot of incidents with the Chinese maritime militia. The members of the maritime militia obviously are not part of the Coast Guard, the PLA. They are usually just random fisher folks, right? Chinese fisher folks that encroach into the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. And once they get to the Philippine EEZ, they would chase the Filipino fishermen away from their traditional fishing grounds. There were several incidents of these happening. Filipino fisher folks have reported it, but President Duterte just says, "Oh, don't worry about it. They're just fishing in our waters. They will share the catch anyway."
Oh.
So there's not that sense of urgency.
And it's funny that you talked about militia. So is there a way to differentiate which one is militia and which one is just maybe a regular fishing boat acting a little bit aggressive?
Officially, of course, the militia will not carry the flag.
Okay.
Right, but the Chinese Coast Guard would definitely have the word Coast Guard in the flag of
Yes.
China. But China has been known to rely on and use its maritime militia because at least in at least officially, China can say, oh, that's not part of the military anyway. So they're just private citizens. So we can't really stop them or control them.
So back to the information campaign, apart from the changes in terms of Philippines presidencies and administrations, what do you think are the reasons behind the differences? I mean, I could think of maybe escalations on the ground, right? So, because back in Duterte, there wasn't such
There were
incidents.
actually, you'd be surprised. There were also a lot of incidences during the Duterte administration, but they were just not reported because he was in denial or just saying that, that did not really happen. So I think the main difference today is that whenever there's an incident that happens, journalists would be reporting about that immediately, and so on.
But for example, the usage of laser.
That's new.
Right,
That's
that's
definitely
new.
new.
Right.
My suspicion is that China has also stepped up on its gray zone operations precisely because it realized that the Marcos administration is not very close to the CCP, unlike Marcos's predecessor, Duterte.
Okay. But other than that, so some of the new development on the ground and some of the political changes, what else do you think contribute to the differences?
I think it's also the fact that there might be changes internally in China. But China is always very opaque, so we don't really know the domestic dynamics within the country.
How about differences in Philippines' capacity? Do you think it also contribute to the information campaign changes?
The modernization of the armed forces is a slow process, right? So it cannot be completed within 3 to 5 years. But one of the changes that may have contributed to the turnaround in the information campaigns could also be because of the closer or reinvigorated alliance with the United States. But that is only possible because of the change in administration as well.
I've also heard that the Philippines had made a lot of efforts in improving its maritime domain understanding via, technological cooperations, taking into account some of the initiative from the EU, for example, and the UN, receiving more aid in terms of building unmanned vehicle
Vehicles.
for information gathering. Do you think it's also one factor contributing to the change?
Certainly, these are all contributory factors, but I go back again to the fact that these are only possible because of the change in administration.
I see.
So if Duterte were still president, I think we would continue to be as isolated as we were starting 2016.
Right. Because you really emphasize the significance of the Marcos administration. So my next question is, do you think the information transparentization strategies is going to be something that the Philippines adopt in the long run, maybe exceeding the Marcos administrations?
Two things that I'd like to mention regarding that. The first is that the transparency initiative should be seen as part of a larger strategy. It cannot be the end all and the be all of what the Philippines is doing. That should also serve as a cautionary tale for the Philippines so that we don't get complacent, right? Because we can keep on calling China's actions out, but if that's the only thing that we're doing, we're not really serving a long-term purpose. And so apart from remembering and thinking that the transparency initiative should be part of a bigger strategic framework, the second thing that I'd like to say is that this may not be sustainable after all, because the Philippines' foreign policy, unfortunately, has a tendency to shift from one administration to another. We are holding our midterm elections next year, and then a couple more years down the road, we will have to vote for a new president. So whether or not this strategy will be continued will depend on who the next president would be.
I see. So you mentioned one of the hurdle, which is possible political changes, right? How about any other obstacle that could counter the effectiveness of the information campaign? I was just wondering that, Philippines is not the only one who step up its transparentizations efforts, but China is doing the same thing. So now I've seen that whenever the Philippines coming out with a statement or a recording footage, video, photos, then there would be a counter photographic evidence from China. I would say these things happen very swiftly, yeah, in a very short amount of time. And they also have videos and photos. So, do you think it is still effective?
For the Philippines, you mean?
Yeah.
It is so far effective, but like I said, it should not be the only tool in our toolkit. So we are now seeing that slowly China is using the same strategy against the Philippines or against other claimant states. So we need to think about a better strategy on how to address China's actions.
I see. And within that strategies, do you think there will be a role for the ASEAN? Because I've also heard, some opinion saying that the Philippines has been acting on its own a lot, right? So how about the ASEAN? Can the ASEAN be a part of the information campaign?
I think ASEAN has always been a part of the Philippines' approach towards the South China Sea, except that in 2012, when there was a standoff in Scarborough Shoal and the Philippines requested help from ASEAN, ASEAN was very limited in its capability to respond and to provide aid and help to the Philippines. That was also one of the reasons why the Philippines decided to file a legal case against China, because ASEAN and other partners and allies were unable to provide support that the Philippines needed at the time. But nonetheless, ASEAN remains to be an important platform for the Philippines and for other claimant states in Southeast Asia.
Okay, so I think that is a positive note to end our podcast on. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Charmaine Willoughby from De La Salle University. Hopefully seeing you very soon in Vietnam.
I would love to go back to Vietnam. Thanks so much for inviting me to this podcast.
This is the end of this episode. Stay tuned for our upcoming discussion, which will be released on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.